How well will vaccines work? They will not simply eradicate COVID-19. Governments need to start thinking about how to live with the virus. Even miracles have their limits. Vaccines against the coronavirus have arrived sooner and worked better than many people dared hope. Without them, the pandemic threatened to take more than 150 million lives. And yet, while the world rolls up asleep, it has become clear that expecting vaccines to see off the coronavirus is mistaken. Instead, the disease will circulate for years and seems likely to become endemic. When COVID-19 first struck, governments were caught by surprise. Now they need to think ahead. To call vaccination a miracle is no exaggeration. A little more than a year after the virus was first recognized, medics have already administered 148 million doses. In Israel, the world's champion inoculator, hospital admissions among those aged below 60 who have not received a jab are higher than ever. By contrast, among the largely by contrast, among the largely inoculated over 60s, they are already nearly 40% below their January peak, and they will fall further. Although vaccines failed to prevent all mild or asymptomatic cases of COVID-19, they mostly seem to spare patients from death. And the severest infection that require hospital admission, which is what really matters. Early evidence suggests that some vaccines stop the virus spreading too. This would greatly slow the pandemic and thus make it easier to alleviate lockdowns without causing a surge of cases that overwhelms intensive care units. Those findings and many more will harden up over the next few months as more data emerge. However, despite all this good news, The coronavirus is not finished with humanity yet. COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
As The Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
The Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
That has profound implications for how governments need to respond.
That has profound implications for how governments need to respond.
One reason the coronavirus will persist
One reason the coronavirus will persist
is that making and distributing enough vaccine
is the making and distributing enough vaccine
to protect the world's 7.8
to protect the world's 7.8 billion
billion people
people
is a Herculean task.
is a Herculean task.
Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country,
Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country,
will not finish with the over 50s until May.
will not finish with the over 50s until May.
To add to the burden, the potency of a jab may fade.
To add to the burden, the potency of a jab may fade,
Making boosters necessary.
making boosters necessary.
Outside the rich world, 85% of countries
Outside the rich world, 85% of the countries
have yet to start their vaccination programs.
until the billions of people who live in them felt the prick of a needle,
Which may not be before 2023,
which may not be before 2023.
they will remain fuel for the virus.
They'll remain fuel for the virus.
Another reason for COVID-19's
Another reason for COVID-19's persistence
persistence is that even as vaccines are making SARS-CoV-2 less infectious,
even as vaccines are making SARS-CoV-2 less infectious
and protecting people against death,
and protecting people against death,
new viral variants are undoing some of their good work.
new viral variants are undoing some of their good work.
For one thing, successful variants
For one thing, successful variants are
are more infectious.
more infectious,
Anything from 25 to 40% in the case of B117.
anything from 25 to 40% in the case of B117,
Which was first found in Britain.
which was first found in Britain.
Infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth.
Infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth.
So cases and deaths accumulate rapidly.
Even if the variant is no more deadly.
To get a given level of viral suppression,
more onerous social distancing is needed. In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa
may also be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection.
may also be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection. hope is that such cases will be milder.
Because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
Because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate.
Finding unprotected people, and because this is what
Finding unprotected people, and because that is what viruses do.
evolving new strains,
Evolving new strains,
some of which will be better at evading the defenses that societies have mounted against them.
some of which will be better at evading the defenses that societies have mounted against them.
And the third reason SARS-CoV-2 will persist
And the third reason SARS-CoV-2 will persist
is that lots of people will choose to remain a target
is that lots of people will choose to remain a target
by refusing vaccination.
by refusing vaccination.
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease
because of their age or underlying conditions.
because of their age and underlying conditions.
Modelling suggests that if just 10% of them
Modeling suggests that if just 10% of them
declined to be vaccinated,
declined to be vaccinated,
and if social distancing were abandoned while the virus was still liable to circulate at high levels,
and if the social distancing were abandoned while the virus was still liable to circulate at high levels,
then a tremendous spike in infections and deaths would result.
then a tremendous spike in infection and deaths would result.
In reality, the share of the overall population that remains unvaccinated
In
In reality, the share of the overall population that remains unvaccinated
In reality, the share of the overall population that remains unvaccinated
is likely to be much higher than in that thought experiment.
is likely to be much higher than in that thought experiment.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Minority communities in many countries, which are most vulnerable to infection,
Minority communities in many countries, which are most vulnerable to infection,
tend to have less trust in the government and the medical establishment. Even among some care workers, as many as half refuse vaccination.
Even among some care workers, even as many as half refuse vaccination.
Despite having seen the ravages of COVID-19 at first hand.
Despite having seen the ravages of COVID-19 at first hand.
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population
needs to be immune for an infected person on average
needs to be immune for an infected person on average
to pass on the disease to less than one contact.
to pass on the disease to less than one contact.
The threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
The threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
That will be a tall order.
That will be a tall order.
For all these reasons, governments need to start planning for COVID-19
For all these reasons, governments will need to start planning for COVID-19
as an endemic disease.
As an endemic disease.
Today, they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
Today, they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
To see how those ways of thinking differ,
To see how those ways of thinking differ,
consider New Zealand,
consider,
sought to be COVID-free
Consider New Zealand, which has sought to be COVID-free
by bolting its doors against the world.
by bolting its doors against the world.
In this way, it has kept registered deaths down to just 20. In this way, it has kept registered deaths down to just 25.
In this way, it has managed to keep the registered death down to just 25. But such a draconian policy makes no sense as a permanent defense.
New Zealand is not North Korea.
New Zealand is not North Korea.
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated,
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated,
their country will come under growing pressure to open its borders.
the country will come under great pressure to open its borders,
and hence to tolerate endemic COVID-19 infections and death.
and hence to tolerate the endemic COVID-19 infections and deaths.
Across the world, governments will have to work out
Across the world, governments will have to work out
when and how to switch from an emergency measure
to policies that are socially and economically sustainable indefinitely.
The transition will be politically hard.
In places that have invested a lot in being COVID-free,
Nowhere more so than China, where vaccination is slow.
or nowhere more so than in China, where vaccination is slow.
The Communist Party has defined every case of COVID-19 as unacceptable.
The Communist Party has defined any case of COVID-19 as unacceptable,
And wide circulation of the disease as a sign of the decadence of Western democracy.
and the widespread of the disease as a sign of the decadence of Western societies.
The adjustment to living with COVID-19
The adjustment to living with COVID-19
begins with medical science.
begins with medical science.
Work has already started on tweaking vaccines
Work has already started on tweaking vaccines
to confer protection against variants.
to confer protection against variants.
That should go along with more surveillance of
um, that should go along with more surveillance of the mutations that are spreading
and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
Meanwhile, treatments will be required to save more of those
In the meantime, treatments are required to save more of those
from death or serious illness.
who contract the disease from death or serious illness.
The best outcome would be for a combination of acquired immunity combination of acquired immunity,
The best outcome would be for a combination of acquired immunity,
regular booster jabs of tweaked vaccines,
regular booster jabs of tweaked vaccines,
and a menu of therapies to ensure that COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
and a menu of therapies to ensure that COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
To the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19,
To the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent the lethal infection of COVID-19,
the burden will also fall on behavior,
the burden will also fall on behavior,
just as it has in most of the pandemic.
just it has in most of the pandemic.
But rather than national lockdowns and months-long school closures,
But rather than national lockdowns and months-long school closures,
which come at a huge price,
which come at a huge price,
the responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
the responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life.
Vaccine passports and restrictions in crowded places could become mandatory.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education
and encouragement but limited protection.
As our special report on the travel industry makes clear,
As our special report on the travel industry makes clear,
people's desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist.
people's desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist.
Even in autocracies like China that may be reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
Even in autocracies like China that may be reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
The persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID.
The
persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID.
The persistence of acute disease and the chronic debilitating long COVID
means that the next stage of the pandemic sounds grim.
But even if the COVID-19 has not been completely put to rest, the situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
The credit for that goes to medical science.
The credit for that goes to medical science.